Hey everyone, I've seen some confusion popping up on the new cover rules in the King's War rulebook, so I wanted to take some photos of some real-world examples and kind of explain the differences of the two new ways to look at it and see it. So it's really important to understand a couple of different things, and we'll go over each of them just to make sure it's clear for everyone involved. We all want, clean game states and everyone to have the same understanding of how this works. So we'll break down each of the rules for obscured target and concealed target. That way it's a little bit clearer and everyone has an idea of how this is supposed to work. In the first photo, there's a complete clear line of sight that's able to be drawn from the Scorchwings to the Fiends. What you do is look at the front facing or whatever facing you're currently within, what arc you're in on your target. This would be the front facing on the Fiends. And if that unit is neither within terrain or has intervening units between them, there's no cover. So in this case, it's a clean shot. You would hit as normal with any other modifiers like stealthy that the Fiends have. So here's the situation I see that people are getting tripped up on. Between obscured target and concealed target, there seems to be a little bit of a legacy understanding of how things worked before and confusion and why that matters. But importantly, each of these define the situation in which they apply, and trying to think outside of that definition is where people, I think, are getting tripped up. So an obscured target specifically is a target that is behind another unit or terrain piece. That's how they get the obscured tag. Okay, so what is behind? That means that there are intervening units between. And specifically, this is the other side of the definition. Concealed units are within terrain. So units within terrain are concealed. Units behind are obscured. That's the major difference. And both of them have the tag of 50% of the base. So if a target has at least half of the line of sight that passes over intervening units or terrain, then that's how you get obscured. To be considered concealed, you have to have half of your base within the terrain. So I understand that it's confusing. I understand that the language is very similar, but that's really the difference. It specifically says within or behind, and that's where it splits out. And this is intended to be a helpful situation. So let's take a look at each of them and why they're different and why it matters. In this situation, if the forest is in front of or intervening between the horde of fiends and the Scorchwings, we take a look and say, okay, we do have an intervening situation. What's the criteria for that? We need to see that unit has at least 50% of its base covered by that intervening terrain or other units. And in this case, the Fiends do not. Measuring from the leader point to where it is on the base, the forest obstructs the line of sight, but not more than 50%. So this is also clean shots. The one area of the rule that people are getting a little bit tripped up on is a parentheses that says, hey, if an obscured unit is also in base contact with it, it includes that difficult terrain. So it's important to keep the distinction between obscured and concealed different in your mind, because they are not concealed. They are not within the terrain by more than 50%. It's just a tiny portion of it, but they are in contact with it. If you look at the lip of the forest, it is blocking line of sight to more than 50% of the Fiend's base. So in this case, they're in contact with it, but it's still blocking more, and it's an intervening thing. The Fiends are behind the forest mostly. They're not within it. This means that it's an obscured target and not a concealed target. Another common situation is with intervening units. In this case, the Shadowhounds, which are height 2. The Fiends are height 4. So the Scorchwings can draw a line of sight, but because more than 50% of the base is obstructed, this would be an obscured target. Typically, you want to look at the height levels. If there's 3 levels of difference, let's say either the Shadowhounds were height 1 or the Fiends were height 5, and there's 3 levels of difference, then they are not an obscured target. So that 3 levels of difference is very important. If the Shadowhounds are situated less than 50%, just like in the prior example, and they are intervening between the Scorchwings and their target, there is not an obscured target in this situation. But the moment those Shadowhounds cover more than 50% of that front base, then it does apply as cover here. The other possibility is when the unit has a footprint inside of difficult terrain. This is going to be the most common instance here. And once they start to get in the terrain, it's the exact same situation where you're looking for 50%. So here, the unit has part of its base within the difficult terrain, but not more than 50%. So it can't count as being inside the terrain unless it has more than 50%. So since it's not, and there are not intervening units in between them that intersect the firing lane, then it's not any form of cover here either. So you can see with the laser line that when we draw and look through, more than 50% of the base is still visible. Not 50% of the fiends are within the base, so there is no cover that applies. Once the fiends have taken more than 50% of their base into the difficult terrain, now they're considered concealed. So concealed is a new definition that basically says when you have more than 50% of your base inside of a terrain feature, then you are now considered to be concealed by that target. So in this case, the fiends are in there. They are now benefiting from the concealed cover. So why split these two rules? And ultimately, it's to provide the players with more defense against shooting. So in the situation that you have both of these possible cover modifiers, so we have intervening units and units inside terrain, and units in the game will only be able to ignore one of these two things. So by giving yourself the advantage of both of them, you can essentially ensure that you're going to get cover regardless of what's shooting out at you. So in this case, if the Scorchwings, for example, had something like Ignores Obscured, the Forest would still protect them because they're both within 50% of their base inside the difficult terrain, giving them concealed. The second that you introduce a piece of terrain that is intervening in between the shooter and the target, that's when Obscured comes into play. So even a height 1 wall here and the Shadowhounds being behind it is going to provide that. So terrain is looked at slightly differently in this new update. You are either intervening with it, terrain or units, or you are inside within units when you are concealed. It is not considered, one example I've seen is a unit inside a forest. They say that the line of sight passes through the difficult terrain inside the forest, so that clearly makes a difference. But it's important to point out that the language of the rule actually says that the target unit has to be behind, at least partially visible behind another unit or terrain piece. It's a totally different thing. You're either within or behind. So make sure that you are clear on those things and everything will make a ton of sense. So 50% behind or in between, and then within the terrain itself. That's really how you tell the difference. So any questions, let me know. I know that the language is very similar between the two, obscured and concealed, and it causes a little bit of confusion, but what it's ultimately for is to give agency to the players to be able to defend a little bit better against a shooting meta that we've seen be fairly strong recently. So just take that into consideration when you're playing your games and try to take advantage of it as best as you can. Good luck and have fun.